2024, the Major John Leroy Haynes Florida Veterans History Program was created to collect and preserve the stories and experiences of Florida's veterans and to recognize the state of Florida's military contribution throughout our nation's history. Through recorded interviews, the Florida Veterans History Program Oral History Collection acts as a living archive of first-hand accounts to capture the details of military service and the voices, memories, and reflections of the Floridians who served. The Major John Leroy Haynes Florida Veterans History Program is operated by the Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture's Florida Folklife Program. Together, we are proud to ensure that Florida's military history is preserved, honored, and shared. My name is Julian Duncan with the Florida Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, Florida Folklife Program. Today is August 3rd, 2025. The time is 3:06 p.m., and I'm interviewing Pat Prellwitz in the Villages, Florida. Also present is Zachary Morrow. This interview is being conducted for the Major John Leroy Haynes Florida Veterans History Program and will additionally be submitted to the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. Good afternoon, Ms. Prellwitz. How are you today?
Fine.
Good. To begin this interview, could you start by telling me where you grew up and a little bit about your childhood?
I grew up in Wisconsin. I lived out in the country as a child, outside of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. Eventually moved into a smaller town called North Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, going to Catholic high school, grade school and high school. Went to nursing school in Fond du Lac, St. Agnes School of Nursing and Marian College. Military provided education for me, and so when I completed my education, passed my boards, I was called into service and was commissioned in the Army Nurse Corps.
Did you come from a military family, or did you have family members who were in the military who influenced you to join?
No, my uncle was in World War II, but that as far as nobody else was in the military. I went in because I was in the student nurse program and they paid for my education.
How did you find out about that pathway? What led you to it?
We had recruiters came to the school, Army Nurse Corps recruiters, and it paid for my education and helped my parents, helped me financially.
What led you to nursing school? What was kind of...
It was something that I was always going to do. It was just something I was going to do.
You knew from a young age you wanted
Yes.
to be a nurse? What first sparked your interest? And you were a nurse anesthetist,
Yes,
primarily. What sparked your interest in that?
I didn't like taking care of patients. To be very honest with you, I did not like patient care, routine bed care. Mm-hmm. And this gave me something special to do. I had my own thing. Mm-hmm. And it was something that I was interested in, and I went to school for that, and I loved it.
And what year did you first enter into the Army?
1961, January 1961.
Okay. How did your friends and family feel about that decision?
They weren't real happy. My dad talked to the parish priest who happened to have been in the Air Force, and he apparently told him that it would be okay, and so I went in.
You remember your first day in uniform and what that was like and being inducted into the Army? And
it was very different coming from the north. And I had trouble understanding a lot of people in the south.
Where were you in the south? Where
we were in San Antonio, Texas.
San Antonio.
Went to the Medical Field Service School.
Okay.
And I did not understand segregation because we didn't have it.
Interesting. It was still
going on.
Had the armed forces been desegregated by this point?
They were, as far as I could tell. I mean, I was living in a BOQ, and there was, I remember a black girl she was a physical therapy student, and everybody was together, and so there was no separation. She was a fine young lady. Everybody got along.
Was that a challenge going from the work environment being desegregated to, I don't know, if you went to dinner or something like that with coworkers, it was a segregated environment in town, or what?
It was, it had to be explained to me that no, she couldn't go with us because she was black.
Wow.
I didn't understand that coming from the north.
Wow. What was your experience like? Were there many women that you served with, or what was that experience like, coming in into the nursing corps in the Army as a woman? Did you work with a lot of other females? Was it primarily male dominated?
It was mostly all female. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I am curious about, had the Army enlisted many women prior to this point, or was this new that women were enlisting, or was it more reserved to the nurse corps? What was the gender dynamic like?
It was predominantly women at that point. There were men, but it was still mostly women.
So, can you describe your training path a little bit, coming in into the nurse corps?
Well, I went through basic, and then I was given my first assignment. I was assigned to Brooke General Hospital. And I worked there for probably 18 months, maybe. I can't remember for sure. And then I was sent to Okinawa. It was my first overseas assignment. And I worked just on doing general nursing work. Kind of more or less ran a floor over there. And then when I came back, while I was there, I also got sent to Thailand for a while, which was interesting. When I came back, I applied for anesthesia school, but I had to go to the career course first. So I did, and then I went to anesthesia school after that.
Was that a civilian school or a military school?
All military.
Military. Roundabout what time is this? What year?
65, I believe.
Okay. So you've been
65, 66.
Okay. Been in a couple years at this point.
Yeah. I went back to Brooke General Hospital for anesthesia school. And that was 18 months.
And then, 18 months in anesthesia school. And then what was your kind of path after anesthesia school? What was next for you after anesthesia school?
I stayed there after I graduated, passed boards and stayed there for a while, and then was sent to Vietnam after that.
How did that feel when you found out you were being sent to Vietnam?
I had mixed feelings. It was like I didn't know if I should be happy or cry. And I went, not knowing what to expect. But I went, just went, because I was told to go.
Where did they send you?
I went to a place called Tuiwa, to the 71st Advac Hospital.
And what did your day-to-day look like working in Vietnam as an anesthetist?
Some days were just routine surgeries, closing up wounds that we had debrided at some other point. Other days were nonstop, depending on what was going on in the war. some days we didn't do anything, which was very rare.
I think you told me when we talked before that there were not very many of you, and so
No, there were 5 anesthetists and then a couple of MDs. And we had 2 operating rooms, 2 Quonset huts. There were I think there were 5 tables in each room. I can't remember for sure. Just table, 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 table. No separation, just one right after the other.
I imagine you had to work pretty long shifts at times.
Sometimes they were 24-hour shifts or longer, depending on what was going on. They kept coming, we kept doing.
How do you sustain that?
I don't know, you just kept going. You didn't think about it, you just did it. So I was there during the big Tet Offensive. And that was, we counted it afterwards, we were doing 120 patients every 24 hours.
This was 1967, 1968?
Yeah, 67, 68, in January 68, when that Tet Offensive occurred. We did GIs first, then the other military. It could have been Koreans, it could have been Vietnamese, whatever military. Then we did civilians, and then we did prisoners last. And that was that was a pecking order, so to speak.
I'm looking at my questions. I've asked some of these. Were there moments, in that it sounds like a really intense experience? Were there moments of humor or camaraderie that stick out to you?
Well, sometimes, we'd have a praying mantis in the urn. We'd have bets to see how long it would take for it to get across the floor in the operating room. All kinds of weird things.
Interesting. It sounds like you're going back and forth between 24 hours of working nonstop and.
I mean, we'd be working in 2. It's still.
Yeah. It's still.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but there was. And then, we barely had the basic necessities. And one of the anesthetists, he was a guy, and his wife sent him a popcorn popper. And we'd sneak over to the mess hall and pinch a few things, get some baby food or something, and we'd make soup in that popcorn popper out of stuff we pinched out of the mess hall at night. And we're lucky we didn't get shot from sneaking over in the middle of the night by the guards. And we'd make stuff over, and the guys, there were a couple of the anesthetists where there were 2 or 3 that were men. And then a couple of, we'd go over in there, hooch, and make soup and stuff. And the popcorn popper, his wife sent him. We did, really weird things, strange things, I guess. All stuff to try to maintain your sanity.
Were there periods of boredom in between the?
Not much.
No.
No, but that's when we had a few minutes times we would do that.
Mm-hmm.
If we get care packages, we'd put it together and make things like that.
What was the food like? What kind of food did you eat on a day-to-day?
Well, we ate everything from mess hall food to sea rations, depending on what was going on as to whether they could cook or whether they screwed with our generator or whatever. Sometimes they screwed with the generator. They would come in and screw with the generator, so we had no power. We ate sea rations. Sometimes the cookie would haul food over to the OR, and we would get some hot food now and then when we were busy. You could eat a whole meal in 2 minutes. In between putting somebody to sleep. While they were getting the next case ready, you ate a full meal.
And what do you mean by they would screw with the generator? What?
It would put sand in the generator.
Who would do that and why?
The VC.
It's like kind of a sabotage.
Yeah.
Wow.
They did that a couple times during Tet.
Were you on a fairly large installation, or were you kind of more forward, or what kind of installation were you on?
I don't know just how big the hospital was per se. We just never got out of the operating room. So I don't know how many beds there were, to be very honest with you. I never found out. We were in our own little world. We just never hardly ever left there for any reason.
What were your living conditions like? I mean, were you close to the operating room?
Right across from you just walked across the road to the hospital.
Oh, well. And in a barracks, or what?
Well, sort of. We all had a room.
Okay.
It had a tin roof and a screening for windows. When the typhoon came, it ripped off the screen and the sand came blowing in, hit you in the face.
Yeah, that's
it ripped off the roof.
You bring up typhoons. What was the weather like in your time there?
It was hot, and then it was very damp, and in the winter it was cold. I mean, it wasn't cold like cold in the north. It was damp and chilly. Or a field jacket, sometimes you put that on.
Let me visualize the time frame either. So you got there in what month, and then or just season even?
I think probably in summer.
Okay. And probably a year, or how long?
I was there a year.
A year.
It was very hot. We were right on sand, right on the ocean.
So, what was your relationship like with the other nurses you worked with, other anesthetists or other nurses generally? What was your relationship like with the other operating room people?
We were friends.
Do you still stay in touch with them?
No. I did. The last person that I kept in touch with, she died this summer.
Were these all people that you were stationed with stateside, or were you?
No, just over there.
Okay, just over there. How much interaction did you have with patients, either after surgery or
none
at all? So you didn't know who was.
Never saw him.
Do you ever wonder, how some of them are? I mean, some of them came into your room and, maybe in a life or death situation. Is that something that you thought about?
They came in. They were put on the table. I put them to sleep. They they left there and went to the recovery room, and then another one was there. Never saw anybody again, other than if they came back for more surgery.
Did your work? I'm trying to think of how to phrase this one. What was your perspective on the war in Vietnam, and how did your work affect that, or did it?
I don't think it did. I don't think we ever thought about it. They were just people that needed to be anesthetized for surgery. That's all.
Can you describe your homecoming experience leaving Vietnam?
It was nothing unusual. Like, I flew home. I was the only woman on the plane.
What was the process like? Were you flown? Did they charter a flight? Did you fly to C-130? Did you fly?
It was there was a charter flight apparently, because it was a whole bunch of it was full. It was a regular plane.
Where'd you fly into?
Flew into Seattle and then into Chicago.
Okay. Did you have a little bit of time before you had to report back, some leave to go visit family, or?
No, that was it. No, let's see. Yeah, I had a little bit of leave, I think, because then I had a little bit of leave, I think.
Do you recall seeing your family or seeing?
Yeah, I came back, saw my family before I went back to my next assignment.
What was that?
To El Paso.
El Paso. Well, what was seeing your family like after that? I mean, how did they react to seeing you again? Or?
I can't, I really don't remember nothing stuck out, I think they were glad to see me, but other than nothing was outstanding, other than the fact that they were glad I was home.
Mm-hmm. And they're still in Wisconsin?
Yeah.
So you drove up from Chicago or took a bus or something like that?
I think, I can't even remember how I got home.
So then you went from...
I don't know if I drove home. A friend picked me up at the airport in Illinois. And then I must have driven myself home from there.
And then El Paso was your next duty station.
Yeah.
So, and you were in for a little while, in the Army. So what did your next duty station look like? What were you doing there?
I was just giving anesthesia, just plain old hospital anesthesia.
Okay. Do you have any experiences, duty stations, locations you went, maybe temporary duties that stood out during the remainder of your service?
Not really.
Okay.
No, I didn't, it just was, I didn't have that many assignments, really.
What assignments did you have after Vietnam's El Paso?
That was it.
That was it. And then when did you decide to leave the Army?
In El Paso.
Okay. So you finished out that contract.
Yeah, and that was it. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So I didn't have that many assignments.
How what year was this when you got out?
69.
69. Okay. And then what was next for you in life?
What was what?
What was next for you after leaving the Army?
Then I went and joined an anesthesia group in Illinois.
Okay. And then you practiced anesthesia.
Yeah.
How was that experience practicing anesthesia outside of the military compared to in the military? Was it fairly similar? Was it very different?
It was probably somewhat similar because I belonged to a group. I did not work for the hospital. I didn't have to respond to them. I worked for a group and they were my boss.
What does that mean, working for a group as opposed to working for a hospital?
Well, the guy that owned the group was my boss, not the hospital. He had a contract with the hospital
Interesting.
to provide anesthesia. And so I worked for him, not the hospital.
Okay. Did you work for that group for the remainder of your career, or did you?
I worked for him for quite a long time.
Okay. Do you feel like there were any, or what do you feel like you took from your military service into your civilian career or into your personal life or beyond the military? What do you think you took from the Army into that?
Well, the Army provided me with a good education, with a good learning experience, and with the ability to do what I wanted to do, which I was very thankful for.
How do you feel your transition out of the Army into civilian life? Was that an easy transition? Was that a difficult transition?
No, it was easy.
Why do you think that was? Why do you think the transition was easy
Well,
in your case?
Because we never had to do all that stuff that the enlisted people had to do. You know, we just came and went and did pretty much as we pleased, so to speak. We didn't have to answer to anybody. Well, we did have to answer to people, but, you know, we didn't have to stand in line and yes, sir, no, sir.
Do you feel like you took any kind of leadership experience out of that, out of being an officer in the Army?
Yeah, well, yeah, because I probably did have a fair amount of natural leadership.
Can you think of any ways that affected your professional life after the Army? That leadership training and experience? Or your personal life after the Army?
Well, I don't know. I'm pretty much my own person.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Are you, or have you been since transitioning from the Army into civilian life and then up to this point? What veterans organizations are you a part of?
I am I'm a life member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and I belong to the American Legion.
And what are your interactions with those groups like? What do you get out of those groups, or what positions have you taken?
Well, I'm not doing anything with the American Legion, but I contributed a considerable amount to the Veterans of Foreign Wars when we lived in Michigan. With my husband and I lived in Michigan, and I was quite active in the VFW there.
Okay. And what is being active? So giving money, going to meetings, what?
I was a post commander and a district commander. Actually, the first female district commander in the state of Michigan.
Yeah, you had mentioned that.
Which they didn't much care about, but.
What do you feel like? You feel like you got a position?
They didn't want a woman. They didn't think a woman should do it.
Do you feel like that changed during your tenure?
Yes, it did. And there's stuff there to show that it did. And I broke the ice for the rest of the women. Now, this year, they have the first female district commander in that state.
Excellent. What do you feel you did what was your approach to handling that opposition and overcoming it and changing opinions on that issue? The
attitude in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is that a woman should be cleaning the house, taking care of the kids, and feeding the chickens. And I told them I didn't have any kids. I had a housekeeper and I didn't have any chickens. I really did tell them that. And I'm here to stay, boys. So buckle up. Were my exact words.
And I'd imagine your track record helped as well. I mean, having done the job you did in Vietnam, that's
And it was not pretty for a while. But I had 3,200 guys in the district. That's how many men there were.
What was the membership like? Were there really any women members?
You were looking at it.
Just you? Do you think that's changed?
No, I don't think there are any. Oh, there was one, but she was really bad news.
How so?
She walked off with money.
Ooh.
They were looking out to arrest her. This was a 3 years ago, because I periodically go back to the meetings. But no, as you can read the article where I ended up getting one of the highest awards that year in the whole.
And what was that award, and what was it for?
Excuse me, when I was district commander at the national meeting, I was awarded, there was only 43 that year. I was awarded All-American status, and only 40, according to the article, only 43 were awarded that year worldwide.
What was that awarded for?
For everything that my district accomplished. I had 22 posts, and I had 20 white hats. White hats are given to the district or the post commanders that accomplish everything that needs to be accomplished in their post, all the different things that are required. So 20 out of the 22 posts meant all the requirements. And I had 30, I think there was like 3,400 men in that district.
And what was your leadership approach in that position to encourage these posts to accomplish those goals? And how did you...
I just talked to them. And there's some, it depended on the post. Some it was like, come on guys, we have to do this. Others it was, you will do this. And others, it depended on the post as to how I approached it. Some it was demanding, some it was cajoling, some it was just, oh, come on, let's do this, I'll help you. It depended on the guys. But they all, and they could have all had it, but they were, 2 posts were like 2 guys short of 100% membership. It was something really silly. But it was, a tremendous year. And then one of them said, we did this for you.
Interesting. And how did it feel to hear that after having gotten so much pushback?
Yeah, in the beginning it was terrible. Yeah. And then eventually they decided that, hey, she's not as bad as it seems. And we will work for her. And they did. And they all did.
Must have been a good feeling.
It was.
What brought you to Florida?
I had a friend who was more like family. She kept asking, she lived down in Naples, and she kept asking me, please come, move closer, move closer. She was, just almost family member. And so I finally said, okay, I will. So I had the house sold. Everything was packed. And 10 days before I left, she up and died.
Sorry to hear that.
So what do? You come anyway. But I had other friends here, so I came.
And what year was this? How long have you been in Florida now?
Since 2010?
Okay. And are you still active with VFW, American Legion?
I
in Florida?
I go to the American Legion now and then. I'm not sure where the VFW is, whether it's a VFW. I think there's one in Wildwood or somewhere. Not Wildwood, but maybe Wildwood. I want to try and find it.
Good, yeah, definitely. And you're active with Tri-County Women's Veterans as well.
The what?
The Tri-County Women's Veterans?
Oh, I belong to that. Yes.
How's your relationship with that organization?
Fine. I head up one of the committees,
Oh, okay. Which committee is that?
the horse committee.
Interesting. What does the horse committee do? And
Well, they have a horse committee where they have women can go participate in riding horses. I think only four people can go. And they work with horses, they groom them, get used to them, where they can become more comfortable and just relax and kind of get their psyche worked out. But only, like it's extremely expensive, and the women's group pays for it.
That's cool. What got you onto that committee? Was that like an appointment? Or was
I'm an old horse person.
Yeah. How long have you been involved with horses?
See that picture behind you? With the horses?
Yeah.
I've been on that trail.
Really? Where is that?
In Wyoming.
Okay. And is this a lifelong thing?
I've been on that trail behind those mules.
Very cool.
Not that they're coming out of hunting camp. That's Fales's mule train. Glenn Fales's. But I've been on there with dudes with a pack train.
Cool. Well, that's interesting.
I've owned horses.
I mean, full circle. Did you grow up with horses too?
No, but I've jumped horses too. I have. Not anymore. Too old for that now.
Well, when did you start with horses?
Oh gosh. When my husband and I lived in, was it when we lived in Wyoming? Back in the 90s.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask, kind of retrospectively, as we move toward wrapping up here, do you have any moments whether in your military career, your civilian career, your personal life, your activity in veterans organizations that you're particularly proud of, or that stand out to you as a moment that you're particularly proud of?
Well, when I went up to get one of those hats that you put somewhere.
For the VFW? Yeah. We'll show that. What advice would you give to a young person, specifically a young woman, but not exclusively a young woman, considering a military career?
Go in as an officer if you can. But it can be a good career if you give it a chance. But it's work. It's not something that's just going to fall in your lap.
Mm. Are there any moments that you feel like today you can look at yourself now and you can think of how your service shaped you and led you to that position, are there things about you today that you feel were particularly shaped by your service that you would attribute to that? How do you feel like your service shaped the person you are today? I'll put it that way.
I think that it gave me the courage to do things that I did and to stand on my 2 feet. That had to. I had to put up with a little bit of nonsense from older ranking ladies because they outranked me by time and grade, as I was reminded of.
Is there anything in this interview that we have not covered that you would like to share?
I can't think of anything in particular.
Okay. Well, with that, I will say then thank you for your time today and thank you for your service.
Okay.